Hi, I'm Carrie, and this is The Creative Obsession. Thank you for joining me. This video, I am going to give some instructions and tutorials on making this quilted table runner. And I designed this table runner to be a skill building, technique building project. So hopefully by the end of it, if you follow along, you will feel confident to take on other quilt patterns and realize that you can do it. And it's a good place to start. Table runners are also easy as a first project because it's more maneuverable when you go to quilt it on your regular sewing machine. I will go through all the steps in piecing this, and I will be quilting it on my long arms. So at the end, when we get to that part, I will be showing you some different ideas for designs, but I cannot show you how to do that on your sewing machine. There are many videos out there that show that. Taking a class at your local quilt shop can help you with that, but I can at least guide you into maybe some designs that can maybe be something you would try. So first off, I want to go over some of the tools and items that you're going to need when you get started. So first and foremost, you're going to need a sewing machine. You're going to need to know how to use your sewing machine and maintain it and understand how to wind the bobbin and all that kind of stuff. Every machine's a little bit different, and so I am not going to give instruction on that. You also need to have a cutting mat. So it's a mat that is designed for using a rotary cutter. The brand really doesn't matter. Something with a fairly smooth surface on it will work just fine. I'm going to show you as we go along on how you can cut fabric without using the lines on your rotary cutting mat. I know that seems scary, but it's really very doable, and you will end up with more accurate piecing. One of the things you're going to need is a rotary cutter. I like to use a 45 millimeter, which is the size of the blade. I like this kind of handle because it locks. I can lock it open when I'm doing a lot of cutting, so I'm not having to grip it, but it also locks when it's closed up. You're also going to need some scissors. I have a set of scissors, a pair of scissors that I use strictly for cutting fabric. I also have a little pair of scissors that I keep by my sewing machine to cut my threads. Speaking of thread, a thread that is a neutral color, it works fine. Most quilt making, you will either use white, a gray, like a medium gray, a medium natural color like a beige, and then sometimes every once in a while you'll use a dark one, but generally you just use those three colors. In this quilt here, I used white thread because I had so much white fabric that I was sewing. I like to use, for myself, I like to use a thin thread. So I use a 50 weight thread so that the higher the number of the weight, the thinner it is. You have to have a ruler. You have to have a ruler that you can use with your cutting mat. I would recommend, if you can, to get two rulers. So I have a 6 by 12. I also have a 6 by 24. If you only have the funds and you only want to get one ruler, get the 24-inch length one because you can cut longer pieces with that. You can't cut longer pieces with your 12-inch. But if you can get two rulers, it'll make things a lot easier and more accurate when you're cutting pieces that are wider than your 6 inches. I like this brand of ruler. This is an Olfa, but I like the fact that the lines on it are pretty thin so that when I go to cut my fabric, I don't have a ton of wiggle room on it. There are rulers out there like this one that have very wide, the marks are pretty wide. That little bit of fudging, when you're cutting, you do that over and over again multiple times to make an entire quilt. Not as critical with a table runner, but the more pieces you put together that are off just a little will make everything off a lot. So you also need an ironing board, an ironing surface of some sort. I don't use a typical ironing board. I have a board that my husband cut to fit over the top of a cabinet that I got on Craigslist, and I've covered it with a couple layers of cotton batting and then some fabric, and that is my ironing surface. It is wider than a typical ironing board and a little bit longer, so I can press widths of fabric on it And being that I don't make garments, I don't need the pointy end of the ironing surface, so that works for me. But use what you have. If you are going to make something yourself, make sure you don't make it too squishy, because the more squishy it is, the more distorted your piecing will be, because when you go to press it, if it presses down, it will stretch it out and distort it. So you want it to be fairly firm. You will also need an iron. I prefer to use an iron that has steam, so my iron has a high capacity for water, and I choose to use steam in mine. If you're using steam when you're piecing or pressing your pieces, you just have to be a little bit more careful with it so that you don't distort it. Steam will relax the fibers, and so you can distort it a little bit easier, but I also feel like it gives me a crisper seam, and so I prefer to use that. In my demonstration, I will be using steam. You choose what you want to do. And then you will need some fabric. I recommend, if you can, to buy Quilt Shop quality fabric. The quality of it is far better than a lot of the fabric you can get at discount big box stores like Joann's and Walmart and that kind of thing, because the gray goods is what they call it. So the base fabric that they dye and print on for Quilt Shop quality is higher than some of the big box stores. And so you have better color fastness, you have longevity, it doesn't deteriorate as fast. But if you can only afford fabric, getting it from Walmart or Joann's or someplace like that, then do that. It's better to do that than nothing at all. You just know that you will have better results and more long-lasting results the higher quality that you can afford to get. Some of the other tools that you will need is some pins. I use this felted wool pin cushion, and I have different kinds of pins in different areas, but the pins I like to use and I recommend using is if you can get glass head pins. Glass head pins don't melt if you iron over them, and mine are extra fine. Getting the extra fine pins helps to prevent distortion when you are pinning. These are the ones that I happen to use. I have no affiliation with Clover, but I do own a lot of Clover products. So these are extra fine patchwork pins. When you use a thicker pin, like when I started with like these that I got at Walmart, and the pin itself is quite a bit thicker than the pins I use today. Let's see if you can see the difference. The pin I use today is a little bit bent. When you go to pin your fabric and you take that bite of fabric to pin it, if your pin's thicker, it's going to distort the fabric a little bit more. The thinner the pin, the less distortion, and you'll have more accurate piecing. But then again, you know, use what you can. It can get expensive to start quilting, so if you just slowly acquire things, if you feel like it's something that you want to continue doing, then every little bit, you know, just pick up something along the way. You will also need a seam ripper. Everybody needs a seam ripper. Doesn't matter how good you are, you will need a seam ripper. This one is made by Clover. I like the fatter handle, but any seam ripper will do. Over time, they do get dull, depending on how much you use them. They last a very, very long time, and I have had to replace mine occasionally just because I've been sewing and quilting for a long time. You will need sewing machine needles. These are the needles that I prefer to use. So they are Microtex 7010, so they're nice. They have a nice thin point, and I feel like I get good piecing with these. People use their needles way too long. I've had people say, well, I don't change them until I start hearing it pop through the fabric. Well, then it's not piercing the fabric properly. I mean, these are not that expensive. So, you know, change them more often than you think. Same with the blades on your rotary cutter. If you, after a while, you know, you cut a lot of fabric or whatever, they get dull. And as they dull, they don't cut the fabric as nicely. So as you're making your cut with your ruler, instead of just slicing through it and not having to use a whole lot of pressure, you're having to push a little harder, and then you're also moving the fabric. And that will not give you accurate cuts. So blades for these can be a little bit expensive, but it's good to switch them out more often than most people do. And you will be happy you did. So changing those out. I like to sew on my sewing machine with a 1/4 inch foot. So this is what mine looks like. If you see the red line here, Most feet have that line. That is a 1/4 inch line. So if you have a sewing machine foot that may look like this, may look a little different, and it has a line down, my needle goes right here. So my needle's coming in here, and then this line right here is a 1/4 inch from the needle. Most feet have that line. That is very handy when you are going to put on your binding, or you sew and you need to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge to turn it. Follow that line. But I like to use this foot on mine. It has a guide, and so my sewing machine sews a very accurate 1/4 inch by sewing, putting my fabric up against the guide, and I'm a 1/4 inch every time. So if you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you can make a 1/4 inch mark on the bed of your sewing machine a couple of different ways. You can take painter's tape or masking tape and just cut off several layers with like an X-Acto knife or something, so they make it kind of thick, kind of padded. Using your rotary cutting ruler or some ruler where you can see the 1/4 inch, put this under the sewing machine foot. Line up your needle so that your needle is on the 1/4 inch mark, and then put your tape against that so that you know when you put your fabric through and you butt it up against that tape or that block that you'll have a 1/4 inch. We will be drawing diagonal lines. You can do that with your rotary cutting ruler. You can do it with just a regular ruler. There's also these rulers out here, I don't even know where, this is from Quilter's Rule. I think I got it as a free giveaway somewhere. And the idea is you put the end on the corner, and then you can mark your line down the center. There's these also, this is made by Omnigrid, and it is 1/2 inch wide, has a line in the center, so you would line that corner to corner, and if you want, you can mark on either side. We are going to be making pieces a little bit bigger and then squaring them down, squaring it up, trimming it down, however you want to say it, to making it be the exact size that we want. I strongly encourage you to learn that way, because things will go together and end up being less frustrating if you do it that way. You want your quilt to lay flat. Especially when you're doing something like a table runner, you want that to lay flat on your table. You don't want it to sit there and be all wobbly. If you're making a quilt for your bed, you don't want the side to be all wavy because things just, it got bigger than it's supposed to or whatever. There's a lot of different reasons why those kinds of things happen. So accuracy is really going to be important. And so I'm going to show you how to make things and do things that are a little bit bigger, and we trim them down. So to trim them down, having your rotary cutting mat with 45-degree marks on it. Also, what I like to use, and one of my favorite trimming up rulers, is a block lock ruler. This is a ruler that has, if you can see the groove, so I'll flip it over, you use it, but your seam of your fabric lines right in that groove, and then makes trimming up really easy. I have a 6-inch ruler. I like using the 6-inch ruler because I can square up anything from a 1/2 inch up to 6 inches, and I only need this one ruler. Another thing I'm going to show you, I'm going to show you 3 different techniques of doing flying geese. So flying geese are these units. You have a goose and you have a sky. These are very, very common in quilts. That is what makes up the star points in these. I'm going to show you 3 different techniques, one of which will use the Eleanor Burns Quilt in a Day flying geese ruler. So, if you don't have this ruler and you don't want to invest in it, then when I show you how to make flying geese one way, you can end up making that, using that same technique on all of them. But I'm going to show you 3 different ways to do it. We are going to go over how to make flying geese. We are going to make half square triangles and 1/4 square triangles. And then you'll also add squares and rectangles, and you do all that, and you've got yourself a pretty good skill base to make pretty much any quilt. Fabric, using high quality fabric is best. Whether you use higher quality or big box fabric, you know, if you're using a higher quality quilt shop quality fabric, you don't have to pre-wash. I don't pre-wash my fabrics unless I have a fabric that is very saturated, or maybe batiks that have a lot of dye on them, because for some reason batiks tend to bleed a little bit more. If you're using a big box store like Joann's or Walmart, I would recommend pre-washing, because they'll have more of a tendency to bleed and to shrink. So once you've got your fabric home, whether you've washed it or not, you're going to need to press it. I highly recommend starching or using a starch alternative, because we are going to be cutting this fabric up into pieces and cutting it across the bias, which is very stretchy. Using some sort of a starch product will help kind of keep everything together and keep things from stretching as bad. So I really like to use Mary Ellen's Best Press. I use the lavender because I like the smell of it, but it comes in different scents and unscented. This is really good for getting the creases and wrinkles and stuff out of your fabric and giving you a nice crisp fabric to work with. If you don't have that or have that available to you, you can use magic sizing or starch. These can be found in your grocery store, Walmart, wherever, in the laundry department. I used this magic sizing. I used this for years before Mary Ellen's came out with this, and now this is pretty much what I use. But this works. When you spray this, or either one, when you spray your fabric, let it sit on the fabric for just a second to let that actually go into the fibers, and then use your iron and press it. I set my iron as hot as it'll go, and that's how I press my fabric. This will leave little white flakes, which is just the product drying with the heat of the iron. Those just flake off. So if that doesn't bother you, this works just fine. And it's more readily available. I think that's everything you're going to need to get started with pretty much any project. So in the next section, I am going to go over fabric requirements, and we'll get started. All right, so let's get our stuff together to make this table runner. So the fabric you're going to need is, you're going to need to decide what you want for your background fabric. In this one, that is the white fabric, and you need 5/8 of a yard. For the border, which I here on this example have as navy blue, 1/2 yard. I used fat quarters to make my stars, my pinwheels, all of that stuff. A fat quarter is a 1/4 yard piece of fabric, but it's cut differently than just yardage off the bolt. You will get something that's about 18 by 21, 22. The way they make fat quarters is they cut the fabric a 1/2 yard and then cut it in half lengthwise. So you end up with a 1/4 yard. It's just in a bigger piece. A 1/4 yard of fabric cut from the width of fabric, you get about 9 inches. And so this gives you a bigger piece. I just happen to have this fabric, and so that's why I chose it. If you are going to go out and buy fabric, I used 5 fabrics in this. I could have used just 4 because I only used this darker fabric in that star, that first star right there. But I didn't have to. I just used it because I had it. So, you know, 3 or 4 fabrics, depends. The more you have, the more scrappier it's going to look. So I would get a 1/4 yard of each fabric just to make sure you have enough to do whatever it is you want to do. And then you're going to need some backing fabric. And that needs about 1/2 yard and a little bit more from somewhere else. Because this quilt ends up being a little bit longer than the width of fabric, you can't just use just the width of fabric. You're not going to quite have enough. But if you have a 1/2 yard, it gives you the width you need, and then we'll just add a little bit to it to make it long enough. So 1/2 yard of fabric plus maybe some left over from one of your fat quarters or some of the piecing fabric that you have for the rest of your stars. So that's all the fabric you need. You get it pressed, and then we'll start cutting it. To go over, one of the first things you need to do before you start cutting your fabric is to get your fabric on the straight of grain. So I'm going to demonstrate that on this piece of gray fabric. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to line up your selvage edges. So what I'm doing is I'm moving it back and forth like that until I can see on the bottom that my bottom is nice and straight. So I'm keeping my top lined up, and across the bottom that's going to end up being a fold, I want to make sure that it's not twisted. You see how that's got like a twist? If your fabric is like that when you cut strips, you won't have a straight cut. You will have a bow at the fold. So let me grab this again. I've got my selvages meeting up at the top, and I'm just shifting it until I can see that they're straight. And then I will lay it down on my cutting mat, and I'll show you how I fold it from there. Okay, so I've got my edges lined up. My selvage edges are lined up, and I'm gonna take that and I'm gonna pull it up to where my fold line is, and I'm gonna line that up straight. And then I'm just going to kind of finger press it across the top and finger press it across the bottom. Then you're going to start cutting. I cut right-handed, so that's how I'm going to cut. So now I need to take my ruler, and I'm using my 6 by 24. So I find the thinnest line, because that's what I like to do, and I'm lining it up against the fold because the fold is where it's straight. Now this has 4 layers, so I make sure that I clear all 4 layers on that side. Take my rotary cutter and give myself a nice straight edge. Now from here, I can make the cuts that I need for my quilt. I want to give you a little tip. If you have a quilt piece that needs to, or a strip that needs to be cut that's wider than 6 inches, if you notice I don't have any lines on my mat, I flipped my mat over so that the lines aren't showing. So I know that this is 6 inches. If I need to cut a piece that's, say, 8 inches wide, I know that I need 6 plus 2. So I will line my second ruler up on the edge at the 2-inch mark. So now I've got an 8-inch wide piece that's being measured, and I can cut along this edge and get 8 inches. I'm not lining anything up with the mat. I'm just making sure, I already know that this edge is straight, but I can also make sure by lining up a line on the bottom of my ruler. Say you're going to do something that is, say 16 inches. Once again, I have 6 inches here. If I turn my ruler sideways, I'm going to do it so that it's 1 through 10 that way. If I line 10 inches up at the edge, so I've got 10 inches plus my 6 inches. If I cut here, that will give me a 16-inch piece. Still not using the lines on the mat. And you can continue to do that. If I needed to be even further, I could use this smaller ruler here, and then this adds another 24 inches. So, you know, use those handy hints. Try not to use the lines on your mat if you have them to cut by, because you'll have more accuracy if you cut it the way I've shown you, using 2 rulers if you need to. Now, if I'm making a 2.5-inch cut, I will just do my 2.5 inches and cut it. I don't need the second ruler for that. The second ruler is handy for when you're making a cut wider than your 6-inch ruler. Okay, so now let's cut the fabric for our table runner. You are going to need 1 strip at 5 3/4. You need 1 strip at 3 3/8. You need 1 strip at 2 1/2. And then we're going to need 4 strips at 1 1/2. And I want to show you an easy way, or a faster way, and a better way to cut when you're going to cut several pieces of the same size. I need 4 cuts at 1 1/2. So 4 times 1 1/2 is 6 inches, which is the width of my ruler. So if I cut that, I slide it over 1.5 inches because that's how wide I need my cut. Slide it over 1.5 inches and slide it over 1.5 inches. What that is saving is that I didn't have to move fabric and adjust my ruler a whole lot to get those 4 cuts. So 1 at 5 3/4, one at 3 3/8, one at 2 1/2, and 4 at 1 1/2. These 4 are going to be our sashing and our borders, so they can be put aside for now. And then with your fabrics that you want to have for your star points and centers and stuff like that, we will be cutting those along the way as we make those blocks. So let's get started in making our first block. Okay, now we're ready to start making block number 1. This is going to be our block number 1, and all this is half square triangles. And so I am going to show you how to make half square triangles, and they're really pretty easy. What you need to determine is what fabrics you want to have as your outside little spikes there, and which ones you want to have inside for your pinwheel. So I have the dark blue and white. We're going to make this unit here, and the way I do it is I take my strip that I just cut at 2 1/2 from my background. I am going to cut off the selvage edge. You never want to use the selvage edge in your quilt. I mean the edge of my fabric to my line on my ruler to make sure I'm cutting straight, and I'm going to cut off that selvage edge and we get rid of it. So I need to cut for this block 8 2 1/2 inch squares. So it's already 2 1/2 inches this way, and so I need to cut it 2 1/2 this way. This is folded in half here, so I actually have 2 layers, so I'm going to be cutting 2 at a time. So to save time, 2 1/2 times 2 is 5. So I will cut at the 5, move my ruler, cut at the 2 1/2. There's 4. Go to the, line it up, go to the 5 and 2 1/2. And set those aside. Now take your strip that you have that is 3 3/8, and we need to cut 2 squares at 3 3/8. It's already 3 3/8 this way. I have 2 layers, a layer of 2 here, so I just have to make 1 cut at 3 3/8. So from the outside, look back at this, for what is going to be these pieces right there, I'm going to cut from my dark blue fabric 2 squares at 3 3/8. And that's what I'm going to end up pairing with my background, and that will help make the half square triangles. Now I need to cut my pinwheels that I'm going to use in the center of my block. I chose these 2 fabrics. So each of these, I need 2 squares at 3 3/8. So I am going to line my fabrics up so I can cut them at the same time. And then what we do next is we're going to mark our fabric. What I like to do is I like to put a piece of computer paper underneath where I'm marking, just because I will go off the edge and I don't want to get it on my cutting mat or a table surface or whatever. So I'm going to draw a line on the diagonal. You're going to line your ruler up at the points and draw a line down the center. So you line up your corners, find your corner here, and you mark on either side. So if I were to do that, and this time I'm using just a regular mechanical pencil because I don't think that I can see the yellow on this fabric. And so then I've actually made a line a 1/4 inch away from the center. This ruler does the same thing. I would line up the lines, let me flip it over, line up the lines on the points of the block and draw my line. If you're drawing it like this, where you're a 1/4 inch away, you're going to sew on that line. And if you sew on this line, make sure your needle is going down just inside the line. If you're going to sew this way, or you've just got a diagonal. I don't like the way that line looks. So you've just got a diagonal. You're going to line your presser foot if you have a 1/4 inch foot, and you're going to follow this line with your presser foot, and you're going to still sew 1/4 inch away from the seam. So let's go to the sewing machine and I'll show you how that's done. All right, we're ready to sew on our machine. I'm sorry if this gets a little loud. I don't know how else to set this up so that you can see what I'm sewing. One thing that's kind of handy is if you just take a piece of scrap fabric, and I'll just fold it in half, and you run it through your machine so that it starts the thread. If you don't hold your thread somehow, whether you're holding it by hand or you're holding it with a piece of fabric, it will get kind of bunched up underneath your piece. So I like to start with something like that. So now I've gotten started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to chain piece. I've lined my 1/4 inch foot. I have the little edge on my foot, and I'm just going to sew following that line with my foot, making sure my fabrics are right sides together. Otherwise, you're going to use that good old seam ripper. Now this piece has the lines on either side of the diagonal, so I will actually follow that with my needle. And as you notice, I didn't cut my thread. This is still attached, my first piece. This is chain piecing. I will then go to my next piece. Just take a couple stitches in between to give space, and you just keep on going. This saves on time and saves on thread. So now I've gotten to the end and all my pieces are attached. So I leave the one in that I just sewed and I just snip it apart. Go through and snip. If you can see, there's just some little threads that connected the two. I'm going to just snip those. I'll snip my little leader there, save it for later, and then go back and do the other side. Okay, so now we just completed sewing all of our pieces a 1/4 inch from what the center line would be. So regardless of whether you marked on the center or you marked on either side of it, we still need to cut these apart. So taking my rotary cutting ruler, I'm going to just cut from corner to corner, giving me 2 pieces. I will do that with all 4 pieces. And now we need to go to our ironing board and press it. So I've just made this makeshift ironing surface just for ease of filming this. It's just a board with a little bit of I think it's got 1 layer of cotton batting underneath and just covered it with some fabric. So I'm wanting to press towards the darker color. So in this case, it's my navy blue. So when you press towards the dark, you're going to lay the color you're going to press towards facing up. What I like to do is set the seam first. Then I just take it, flip it, hold the piece down with my iron and gently go over the seam and then press down. I am not pushing, I am just pressing. And so that's what my piece will look like. I will continue doing that until I've gotten all 3 done. Okay, so now we have all of our half square triangle units sewn, and we're making this block here, but they're a little bit too big, and we did that on purpose because a lot of times these can end up being just a little bit off, and so you want to have room to trim it down. So one way to do it with your rotary cutting ruler, let me get these out of the way, is I want to trim these down to 2.5 inches. So using the 45-degree mark on my ruler, I'm going to line that up with the seam of my piecing. And I want to make sure I stay within the 2.5 inches. And I'm going to trim the top, the side, and the top, the 2 edges that are exposed, pulling that away. Now I want to do a 180 flip, do the same thing. Line my 45-degree markup, but now I want to line it up with my 2.5 by 2.5. And I'm going to trim. Sometimes that seam wants to kind of push over a little bit, and trim. Now I've got an exactly perfect 2.5-inch square. So another way to do it, and this is my preferred method, is to do it with the block lock ruler. So I'm going to show you how that works. This ruler has a groove on the bottom of it and is made specifically for squaring these things up. So I've pressed towards the dark, so this is my high side. I put my block lock, it locks it in, so up against that a little bit just to make sure I'm on the groove. Stay within my 2.5 inches. I trim and I trim. And when I do a cut from a corner, I don't start at the corner and go into it, because you will slowly nick away the corner of your ruler. So if you kind of go in a little bit, push down to make the cut, go back and forward. And that kind of saves the corner of your ruler no matter what kind of ruler you're using. So now this is still in the groove. I will turn the whole thing around. I will slide it down. Push it up here so you can see it. And now I'm going to get in the 2.5 inch, within the 2.5 inch lines, and trim again. And I have a perfect 2.5 inch. So continue to trim all your half square triangle units to 2.5 inches, and then we'll start putting the block together. Okay, now we're ready to put our block together. So following along with how this block looks, we're going to take our background squares, and you're going to do a background square. I'm going to follow along this way, and then we're going to do one of our half square triangles, making sure you put it here so you can see, making sure that the dark side is in the right place. Then we do a background square. So then what you're going to do is you're going to take this, lay that out next to your sewing machine if that's easier for you, and you're going to sew. Okay, so now you've got all your little rows sewn together, and now we're going to press them. And so what we want to do is we want to offset the seams. So we want to press one row, all the seams going one way, the next row, all the seams going the other way, and then that way when we put the two strips together, those seams will interlock with each other, and it will all lay nicely. So when we go to sew this seam here, when we do this, our seams are going to nestle. They're going to go in opposite directions, and then that makes everything nice and tight, and your points will be pointier, and so on. So continue doing that till you get it all pressed. Go to your machine and sew your seams. What you're going to want to try and remember is that to make sure your seams lay flat. So double check it every once in a while as you're approaching your feed dogs. Sometimes they want to flip them the wrong way, and just get under there with the tip of your scissors or something like that to flip them, because as they feed through, sometimes they'll flip back, and you don't want that to happen. So in the center here, when you've got a pinwheel that comes together, that can be kind of bulky. And so if you can take the seam, I'm trying not to burn myself here, take the seam and split it apart a little bit and get it to lie flat. You're going to get half of the seam to go one direction, the other half of the seam to go the other direction, and that opens that little point a little bit, and it helps reduce some of the bulk that you'll have. And we've got our first block done. I hope you enjoyed making your first block and learning how to do half square triangles. Half square triangles are in a lot of quilts, and there's a lot of different things you can do with it. So it's always good to know how to go about doing that. In this segment, we're going to learn how to make block number 2, and that is this block. So we are going to learn our first method of making flying geese. And let's go over to the cutting table, and I will go over how to cut your fabric and how to make this block. Okay, we're going to make block number 2, which is this block here. And this is how you're going to need to cut your fabric. For your center square, you need a 4.5 inch square. So figure out what color you want to put in the middle and cut a 4.5 inch square. The color that you want to have, the fabric that you want to have as your star points, you need 4 squares cut at 2 7/8. And then as far as your background, you need your 4 2.5 inch squares. And then to make the flying geese, so the background piece that will be in the flying geese, you need 1 square cut at 5 1/4. And the reason why we're cutting these figures and the way that you can use this method to make other flying geese that are a different size, we want our flying geese to finish at 4x2. So that means the size that it is once it's inside the block, taking out all your seam allowances. We want 4x2. So for your sky fabric, you want to take the width of your flying geese, finished size of your flying geese, and add 1 1/4 inches. So we're cutting this at 5 1/4. You take your height or the depth or the width or however you want to look at this, and the finished size for our block is going to be 2 inches, so we add 7/8. So we are cutting our star points at 2 7/8. So those measurements can be used no matter what size flying geese you decide to make. So let's get started on making this block. What you're going to do first is you're going to take your 2 7/8 inch squares and draw a diagonal line on all 4 of them. We don't need those right now. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take our 5 1/4 inch square and we're going to line those blocks up in the center and line that one up in the center. And my line will continue on because those are lined up directly on top of each other. I like to put a pin on each one because it just holds everything in place. If you were making multiples of these, it's nice to have a pin to hold it all in place while you go to your sewing machine. When we go to sew a 1/4 of a line on either side, you want to take a scant 1/4 inch seam. You'll see that a lot in quilt patterns where they refer to a scant 1/4 inch. And what that means is you're going to sew your 1/4 inch seam somewhere in there. You want to sew just to the inside of what would be exactly a 1/4 of an inch to give yourself a little bit more room out here. And a scant just means basically the width of the needle in your sewing machine. So if you are following a line out here, put your needle just to the inside of that. If you're following the edge of your presser foot on the center line, put your presser foot just on the other side of it so that your stitching line moves in more towards the center by just a width of a needle. So you'll see that a lot on quilt patterns. And so it's just good to know what that means. So go to your sewing machine, sew your 1/4 of an inch line, your scant 1/4 of an inch line on either side of your center line, and then we'll cut it apart. All right, so I've sewn my seams a scant 1/4 of an inch from the center line, and then I cut on the line. Now take this over to your ironing board or your ironing surface and press these little triangles up. Being gentle because you've got bias edges here, so you're going to just put your iron on and press forward. Do that on both pieces. Now your pieces should look like this. What you're going to do next is you're going to take your other squares and you're going to put them on the opposite side of this strange looking little unit and pin it. You're going to sew it the same way as you did when you did these pieces. Sew a scant 1/4 of an inch from your center line, and then we'll cut it apart again. So I've sewn a scant 1/4 inch from the center line, and I've cut it apart, and I'm going to press the same way I did with my first pressing. Just press it towards the triangles. So now we've got all our pieces cut apart and pressed, and so now we're just going to trim it up and make sure we're our unfinished size, so the size that it is before you put it into your block, is 4.5 by 2.5. So I take my ruler, I use my 45-degree line on my ruler to make sure that I'm staying pretty straight, and I line that up with my seam line. Another mark I'm also looking at is there's a 1/4 inch line right here on my ruler, and I'm lining that up with the point of those two pieces. So my 1/4 inch mark is lining up right there, and I'm going to trim off the little bit of excess. There shouldn't be a whole lot of excess with this method. It's a pretty true to size method. And now I turned it around following the 2.5 inch mark on that side, because I know I have a straight edge there, and there's nothing really to trim off. I mean, a couple threads, so that wasn't even necessary. So now I'm going to turn it this way, and I want to make sure that it's 4.5 inches this way, but I want that center point to be in the middle. So I'm going to follow 2 1/4, which is half of the width of the unit, and have my 2 1/4 mark right at that point. I'm going to line my ruler up so that it's on. I'm trying to follow a straight line here. I'm at 2 1/4 here. It looks like I could scooch over just a smidge and then trim the edge. Very little comes off of that. And now we should be able to just trim it up at 2.5 by 4.5. And that's all the waste that you have on that block. So continue doing that until all 4 of your pieces are trimmed, and then we'll put the block together. Okay, now it's time to put our block together. So this is what we want it to look like. So I've got my 4.5 inch square in the middle. I've got all my flying geese that I'm going to put around the sides of that. And then the corners are just background fabric. So you're going to go ahead and sew this together like you did in the last block, where you sew it in rows. Press towards the solid pieces of fabric, so no seams. So press towards your corners and then press towards your center. That way your seams will offset, and then we can put it all together. So let's sew our rows together, and we'll move on from there. Something I want to mention: when you go to sew your flying geese, it's good to have your flying geese unit on top. So when you're sewing your 1/4 inch seam, try to hit this intersection when you're going along. Sometimes if that's just off just a little bit, you may need to take a bigger seam or a little bit less of a seam right there. Having your intersection cross right there will give you that nice point. So it's just a good rule of thumb to try to sew any pieces like this with them facing you, so you can keep an eye on how everything's going. Okay, so now we've got our rows done. We've pressed our seams. So we are going to put our rows together, but I wanted to show you when we press our seams going opposite directions, line those seams up and they will just nestle right in, and then everything will just line up really beautifully. So that's why we try to press so that our seams go in opposite directions, so that that intersection can be really nice and clean. So go ahead and put your other two put your strips together here, and then press towards the center, and your block will be done. Okay, so now you have block 2 finished. One thing I want to mention, you may notice that your points don't go all the way to the end of the fabric, and that's what you want, because when you sew this into your quilt and you take a 1/4 inch seam, that point will be right at the seam. This is a really good method for making flying geese because it makes them pretty accurately, and with just a few seams you get 4 flying geese. So you know, hopefully you can use those instructions when you decide to make other quilts that have flying geese, just following the measurements of having your background fabric 1 1/4 inches bigger than your finished size, and your star points 7/8 inch bigger than the finished size. So block number 2 is done. So now we're going to go on to block number 3, where we are going to learn a different technique for flying geese, where we alternate colors on either side. So let's do that. So hopefully you've enjoyed making the previous 2 blocks. Now we're going to move on to block number 3. In this block, I'm going to teach you what I'm going to call method number 2 for doing flying geese. And what that does, that is the top block that I have up there in that table runner. And the way it's going to turn out is that you're going to have 2 different colors as your star points. And so there's a lot of quilts that will use that look, and it can create some other secondary designs by alternating that your star points aren't the same fabric. Okay, we're getting ready to make this block, and I want to show you how to cut, or what fabric you need to cut. So from your background fabric, you need 4 2.5 inch squares, so you can cut that from your strip that you've already got cut. From your strip that you cut at 5 3/4, you need 4 2 7/8 by 4 5/8 strips. So what you can do is with your fabric folded, because this is a little wider than you need, you'll just cut 2 7/8 inch from the edge, turn it around, square it up to being 4 5/8. Then from the fabric that you want to have as your pinwheel fabric, you need to cut 2 from each fabric at 3 3/8. You will be then squaring them down, making your half square triangles like you did in the first block, and sewing it into a pinwheel. Then the fabrics that you want to have as your star points, you need to cut 4 from each fabric at 2 7/8. So those will become our star points. Get that all cut, and then we will assemble the block. So what I have here, I'm going to want a flying geese that's going to end up being 4.5 by 2.5. So I've got my background fabric that is cut at 4 5/8 by 2 7/8. This is going to allow a little bit of room for squaring up. Then I have a square of each of my colors cut at 2 7/8. Got a diagonal line drawn on both of my squares. What I'm going to do is, because I want to have mine so that for my green to all be on this side, I start with my green, I put it here, I've got my diagonal line. I am going to sew on the line. So go to your sewing machine, sew on the line, and then we will trim this up before we put on the next piece. Okay, so as you can see, I just sewed right directly on the line. I am now going to take my ruler, and I'm going to line my 1/4 inch mark on that sewn line, so that I'm cutting 1/4 inch away from where I stitched. This is the waist that you end up with these. If you are adventurous, you can also sew 1/4 inch from here, and you'll end up with tiny half square triangles, or you can just throw them in the garbage. So then what we're going to do is we're going to piece this to the outside. We're then going to take your next color and sewing on the line, going from the center to the outside, or the outside of the center. You just want to make sure your line doesn't go this direction. So press this piece over and sew your next piece on the line. You're going to then trim it 1/4 inch away, just like you did this one, and you're going to end up with your flying geese just a smidge bigger than you need it, and I'll show you how to trim that down. Okay, so now we've got our unit that we just sewed together and pressed. We want to trim it down to the correct size that will fit with our quilt block. So like I said earlier, I want this to be 4.5 by 2.5. So I am going to take my rotary cutting ruler with my 45-degree line and my 1/4 inch mark at that point, and I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to turn it, and I want to cut it at 2.5 inches. My 45-degree line should match up with that seam, and there's just a little bit to cut off the bottom edge. Now I need to cut it so that it's 4.5 inches wide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my 2 1/4 inch mark, and I want that to be right there at that seam, right where those two pieces make a point. I want my 2 1/4, which is halfway. Trim off my side and trim off the other side, making this 2.5 by 4.5. At this point, I'm just going by my 4.5 inch mark and making the little trim. So as you can see, we didn't have a whole lot of waste when we were trimming it, but what the waste is it's your triangles that you trim off when you cut off these seams. But it gives you a nice way to do flying geese where you can have 2 different colors, and it's nice to know a different way to do it. So now I'm going to put my star together. I've got my pinwheel center done, I've got my flying geese done, and then my 4 corner squares. Put them together in rows like we've done in the past. When you go to press this, you will have bulkier seams because you have a seam from your half square triangle and a seam from your flying geese. Just press gently. Press towards the center because that is the less bulky. Press towards the outside squares because that's the less bulky, and then everything will line up. So go ahead and sew it all together, do your pressing, and your block will be finished. Okay, there we have it. We've made block number 3. This was method number 2 for doing flying geese, and I hope you learned something. I hope you at least gave it a try. Sometimes flying geese can be a little bit tricky, but making them a little bit bigger and trimming them up and knowing how to do that is really the key to success. So when I finished my block, I pressed away from the center on those final 2 seams. So here, let's do it this way. So this was my top row, my center row, and my bottom row, and I pressed away to alleviate some of that bulk. So there you have it, block number 3. We've got one more to go, and that will be our more complicated block where we're going to learn how to do quarter square triangles and another method for flying geese. And then we're on to doing some sashing and borders, which is super easy. So I hope you enjoyed doing that, and let's move on to block number 4. Okay, now we're ready to make block number 4. And so the 4th block is the one that's on the bottom here in this example. So in this one, we're going to go over how to make quarter square triangles. So a quarter square triangle is exactly what it sounds like. It is 4 triangles that make up a square. So each triangle is a quarter of the triangle. So for this block, we're also going to learn the method to make flying geese using the Quilt in a Day ruler. If you don't have this and you don't want to follow along using these instructions, then you can use one of the previous ways of making flying geese and it'll come out the same. So we still end up with the same size flying geese. This is just a different technique. So if you don't have this ruler and you don't want to invest in it quite yet, then follow one of the previous examples of how to make them. But for this block and for this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to do it using that tool. Okay, so for making this block, we need to cut some fabric. So we are going to be using the Quilt in a Day method. So if you have this ruler, you already know what information you need out of this book, but I'm going to show you how to do it anyway in case you don't have the ruler, and then maybe you can see whether or not it's something that you would want to purchase in the future. So for this, out of our background fabric, you're going to need your corner squares. So you're going to need 4 2.5 inch squares. From your strip that you have that's cut at 5 3/4, you need to cut 1 5.5 inch square. For the center that we're going to do quarter square triangles, you need to cut 2 squares from one fabric. So whatever fabric you want to have the most of in the center, cut 2 squares at 3 7/8. And then from the alternating fabrics, you need 1 each 1 square each of 3 3/8. So all of these are cut into squares at 3 3/8. You just decide which one you want to see more of. So 2 from one and 1 from the other 2. Then for your star points, you want to cut 1 square at 7 inches. And that will give you 4 flying geese. So get all of that cut, and then we will mark our squares and get sewing this together. Okay, we're going to make quarter square triangles. I've got 2 squares that are cut at out of the same fabric at 3 3/8, and then 2 different fabrics cut the same size. So these are 3 3/8 inch squares. So we are going to put, right sides together. Put our squares together so that we have a green and one of the other prints. And then we are going to sew 1/4 inch from the line and then cut on the line. So basically right now we're making a half square triangle. Okay, I've got both of my squares sewn 1/4 inch from the diagonal line. And so now I'm going to cut it on the line. And I am going to press towards the green. So I'm pressing towards the color that I have the most of. So do that with both of your pieces and then come back here and we'll trim them up. All right, so now we have our half square triangles. I want to trim these down to 2 7/8. So using my regular rotary cutting mat or ruler, I'm going to use my 45-degree line. I'm going to find where my 2 7/8 is and make sure it's within that size because I want to cut around all 4 sides. And I'm going to flip it, keep my 45-degree line on the seam line, and now I'm going to trim it right on the 2 7/8 and trim those sides. So do that with the other 3 and we will have our pieces that we need for our quarter square triangles. We're going to draw a diagonal line going across this way. So I'm just going to use my mechanical pencil and make sure I get it in the corner. Draw my diagonal line that way before you put these 2 together. Making sure my seams are nestled in, and then I'm going to sew 1/4 inch away from this line and cut it on the line. All right, I've got both of my pieces sewn, so now I'm going to cut it apart, and when you open this up and press it, you've got a 1/4 square. These are really fun to make hourglass blocks, which is basically what this is. And then depending on how you mix and match where you put them, you can get a pinwheel in the center. There's a lot of variations on how you can play with this 1/4 square triangle unit. All right, all of my 1/4 square triangle units are pressed. I do need to trim this down to make sure that these are only 2 1/2 inches. Which they should be, and all I should have to do is trim off the dog ears. So that looks pretty good. And really all I have sticking out are these dog ears that can come off. All right, all my 1/4 square triangles are trimmed down, and so I wanted to just kind of play with some layouts. This is going to be the center of my star. And so I want to just try and see, I could play with it. So if I did it like this, like that, I get a pretty distinguished square with pinwheels in the middle, and I kind of like that. I could also change it, and I could do something like this, which gives me a different kind of a look in the square in the middle. I could do it with the lighter color and the green by just flipping these around. So I still have that square with a pinwheel, but I kind of like it with the dark in the middle because I think that that pinwheel to me seems like it stands out a little bit better. So I think I sew mine together like that so that I have the darker center. I kind of like that. So there is my quarter square triangle unit that's going to be the center of my star. So now I'm going to work on my flying geese. So if you have this set, the instructions are in here, but I'm going to just briefly go over and show you how to use it. If you don't have it, then you can kind of see how it works and see if it's maybe something that you would like to try. So we want to have a 4.5 by 2.5 inch flying geese unit. So we start with a 7-inch square. The big square is the sky. It is the pieces that are out here on the sky. Your background piece, which is your goose, you cut at 5.5. You lay it in the middle. I find the middle the best I can. I draw a line on my background fabric because you are going to sew on that. And then I fold my dark piece, or the piece that will be the sky, I fold it in half to give myself a crease to kind of line my corners up with. And so, so I've got it pretty much in the center. I am going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of my line, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I've sewn 1/4 inch on either side, and now I am going to cut this in half with my rotary cutter and my ruler. So, but I'm going to cut the entire thing. So I want to make sure I'm lining up with the outside corners, and I'm going to cut that in half. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to my ironing board and I'm going to press it towards my bigger square, so towards my dark. So I'm going to put this on top, set my seam, and press it and end up with a piece that looks like this. Okay, so now I have my two pieces. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them together so that the corners match. Both of my corners match. I have a diagonal line going across the seam. So I took my ruler and drew my diagonal line. I am now going to sew 1/4 inch from that line, and then I will cut it on the line. Okay, I sewed on my line, I cut it apart. Now what you're going to do is you're going to take the piece, you're going to fold it, and you're going to take your scissors. So I use my fabric scissors, and you're just going to make a snip, stopping just before you hit the stitching line. Let's do that again on this one. Because your seams are not next to each other on this, this gives it a way to press in both directions. So if you can see, so hopefully you can see that. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to our ironing board, and we're going to press one way and press one the other way. So our seams go in opposite directions. That's why you need to have that little slit. We're going to do that with both of these pieces. Okay, so if you can see, I had made that slit, and that allowed the seams to go in opposite directions, and I pressed them both towards the dark. Did that on both pieces. And now you use the ruler that comes with it, and there is a green line, and that's the size of the flying geese that we are making. And I line my green line up with my seam line, and I will trim up here, and I will trim across, and I'll just go all the way across. Even though I don't have a ruler there, I want to separate that. So that comes off. Now, if you have a small mat that you can put this on so that you can turn the mat, that's actually ideal, or you'll have to reposition it. So I will reposition it because I didn't get my other little mat out, and I'm going to trim here, and I'm going to trim here. And then I have a perfect flying geese. So you will do that with all of the pieces, and you will end up with 4 flying geese. Let me show you what it looks like if you have a small mat that you can use. It's actually a pretty effective way of doing some trimming. So this is another way that you can trim these down. I have a smaller mat, and I will trim this across the side. across, all the way across the top. Make sure I got that seam. And now instead of moving my piece, I just move the entire mat. That keeps my piece perfectly in place from where I cut it the first time, and then I continue with my cuts and end up with my perfectly cut flying geese. So you're going to put this together just like you did the other 3 blocks. I'm not going to go over it. Press it. I would probably press towards on this block, because you've got so much going on right here. Would have a tendency to press it out towards the flying geese, which then means you have to press this towards the flying geese here too, so that these seams can oppose. So go ahead and sew it together, press it, and then your block is finished. Okay, so you just finished, hopefully, your 4th block, which was star number 4. We're going to move on to putting on some sashing. So the sashing is the little bits of fabric that go in between blocks, and they can, depending on the quilt, they can be different sizes. So our sashing, I just have it as a thin sashing, and I did that just for one, to teach you about what sashing is and how it's used, and then to also, it gives a little buffer between the star points. If they all lined up together, then you'd have to really be sure that you were super accurate and everything lined up just perfectly so that those points all lined up. So it's nice to have that little bit of a cushion in between. So what you're going to need for your sashing is you're going to need to have your background fabric. You're going to need 4 cuts at 1.5 inches. That gives us enough for the sashing and for the little bit of a border that goes around all of it that allows those stars to kind of float. Then you're going to need, from one of those strips, you're going to need to cut 3 strips at 1.5 by 8.5, and that's what's going to fit on the blocks, because our blocks right now are 8.5-inch squares. When they get all sewn in, they're known as an 8-inch block, but we don't count that seam allowance when we talk about a finished size. Lay them out on the floor, lay them out on your bed. If you have a design wall, it's nice to lay them out. Lay them out and kind of look and see which ones go well next to other ones, trying to balance out your color a little bit and see what looks pleasing to you. It's helpful sometimes to just be able to stand back from it. So if it is on a floor or if it's on a design wall or something, you can stand back and get a good look at it. Another way to get that distance is to take a picture with your phone, because then that's it's giving you some distance from it, and or also looking at it with your eyes kind of squinted, it takes away the piecing and just focuses on the lights and darks of the colors. Because if you've got, depending on how you played with your colors, you may have a couple of blocks that are feel heavier or feel darker, and maybe you don't want to have those two together. You want to split them apart. So lay them out, get a feel for how you want them to go together, and then on 3 of them, you're going to put an 8.5-inch square on one side, and then we'll sew those all together and then put a border around that. So get to that point, and then in the next segment we will go over how all of that gets put together. When you pressed your sashing, when you sewed your sashing, I forgot to mention to sew it from the pieced side, because that helps you keep track of what the seams are doing. On this one, I forgot to do that, and I pieced it from the sashing side, and my seam flipped over. So you try to avoid that happening, especially if you're going to do any kind of stitch in the ditch work, because your ditch is now all messed up. Okay, so once I've measured my table runner measured out at 35 inches long. So now I need to cut 2 strips to go on either side of it. So I have my fabric here, it's folded in half. I need to cut 2 of them. So I have, I've stacked both of them together. I've got the fold on my left side because I'm going to be cutting on the right side. So I need 35 inches, and the way I do this is I figured out what half of that is, and so half of that is 17.5. I use my long ruler and I line up 17.5 inches on the fold, and then I will cut that bit off. what that's done is I now have a 35.5-inch strip. Keeping that fold kind of pressed because we will use that to find the center of our table runner. So I've got both of my pieces. I've got my table runner with my sashing put together. I'm going to fold this in half. What I'm trying to do is find out right where the center of the block is, or the table runner is. So I just kind of do a little press at the top and lining that up over here. I do the same thing on this side. So now I have where my center is. I've got kind of a little fold mark. So I take my piece that I just cut at 35 inches and I match up those folds and then I pin it. And that is the center of my table runner. Then I go across and I make sure that the end is matching and I pin that. And then what I do is you just kind of like straighten it out, because sometimes the seams want to kind of pull in. So you just kind of straighten it out and put another pin in at where the center of that would be. And you do the same thing on the other side. So this is how we put on any kind of a border. Even if it's a whole quilt, you'll do the same thing. It'll just be bigger. You find the center of your pieced quilt, whatever, find the center of your border piece and match those, match the end, and then just pin however many you need based on how big it is. This is as many pins as I'll put here because that's not a very big piece. So continue to do that for the rest of this side and do that for the other side and sew those seams. All right, so you've sewn both sides of your quilt. Now you need to take a measurement of how wide your quilt is. I'm not going to give you a measurement. I want you to actually measure your quilt. Yours is going to be just a little bit different than mine. Everybody's turns out just a little bit different. It could be different by just 1/8 of an inch. But take that measurement. Take a measurement from either end and in the middle to see that you're square, and cut your side border, or what would be like the top and bottom or the sides. Cut that 1.5-inch strip to the width of your table runner and sew that on just like you did the long border. And then we're going to add our final border. So you're going to need 3 2.5-inch strips. Measure your quilt, your table runner, see how long it is, and cut 2 strips to the length of your table runner and attach it the same way you did with the short ones, finding the center and pinning it to either end. Stay away from thinking, oh, I'll just make a long strip, sew it on, and then I'll just cut that off later. That doesn't keep your quilt straight. That's part of the reason why people end up with quilts that are wavy and don't lie flat, because that little bit extra that you think you're getting straight really isn't. So find your center. It's worth the extra, couple seconds that it might take you to find the center, pin it to either end, make sure everything is straight in between, and then sew it. Your quilt will end up way straighter. So do that on both sides. Take another measurement once that is sewn on and get a new measurement. Take your third 2.5-inch strip and cut that to your width measurement and attach it to both sides, and then you're done. And then it's ready to be quilted. So I'm going to go ahead and put my final borders on, and I will meet you back up at the design wall. Well, congratulations, you finished your table runner. I thank you so much for sticking through it to the end. If you did, I know this was kind of a long video, and there was a lot of information. As you practice these different techniques and practice just sewing quilts and making blocks and stuff like that, it does get easier and it does go faster. But this is a good way to start. And so now I hope that if you look at a quilt pattern and you think, gosh, do I know how to do that? That you will hopefully feel confident in knowing that you can do it. You've got some really good basic information to get you started. Now, these are just my ways of doing things. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do things. So keep experimenting and keep checking things out. I will do a separate video for the quilting and the binding, But for now, enjoy your table runner, and thank you so much for following along with me.